Okay, so I'm gonna go ahead and do our little introduction. Good evening and welcome to tonight's live online author event with Greenlight Bookstore. I'm Oliver from Greenlight Bookstore, and we're thrilled to host tonight's event with Travis Lupick launching his new book, Light Up the Night, America's Overdose Crisis and the Drug Users Fighting for Survival. He will be talking with Beth Macy, so you're in for an excellent time. Before we start, I just want to say a huge thanks to Travis, Beth, and the team at New Press for making this happen, and to all of you for showing up. Although we're not able to host events in the store spaces, our community of authors and readers is still here. We're really grateful for your support and the chance to make a space for conversation and connection. Just a couple housekeeping things. In our Zoom webinar tonight, you can see and hear the speakers, but they cannot see or hear you. They can see that you're here though, and there are a couple different ways you can interact with the authors and with each other throughout tonight's event, which we highly encourage. The first is the chat, which you can find by clicking on the icon that looks like one speech balloon. You're welcome to post your comments and thoughts in the chat. It's a great way to show your appreciation for the author and interact with fellow attendees. If you have a specific question and you'd like answered by the author, please post that question in the Q&A module. You can find it by clicking on the icon that looks like two speech balloons. We'll be pulling questions only from the Q&A to be answered in the later part of the program. And importantly, tonight's featured book, Light Up the Night, is available for sale from Greenlight Bookstore. You can shop in person from 10 a.m. to 8 p.m. At both our Fulton and Flatbush Avenue stores, where you can purchase Travis's book and many other on site. You can also order online at greenlightbookstore.com for a quick pickup at the store or for shipping anywhere in the US. I'll drop the buy link in the chat. As a thanks for attending tonight's virtual event, we are offering 10% off the featured book. Enter coupon code GreenlightEvents10 in the coupon discount section of the checkout online for 10% off. If you care about supporting the careers of authors and the ongoing existence of independent bookstores, buying tonight's featured book is a great way to show your support. Our interviewer tonight is Beth Macy, author of the widely acclaimed and best-selling book, Dopesick, True Vine, and Factory Man. Based in Roanoke, Virginia for 3 decades, she has won more than a dozen national awards for her reporting, including a Nieman Fellowship for Journalism at Harvard and the 2021 George Mason Award. She will be speaking with our featured author, Travis Lupick. Lupick is an award-winning journalist who has written for the Los Angeles Times, Los Angeles Group of Drug Users Transformed, Los Angeles Reviews of Books, and Vice Magazine, among others. He is the author of Fighting for Space, How a Group of Drug Users Transformed One City Struggle with Addiction, and he lives in South California. Travis's new book, Light Up the Night, is a revelatory movie narrative that offers a harrowing critique of the war on drugs from voices seldom heard in the conversation, drug users who are working on the front lines to reduce overdose deaths. Light Up the Night is published by the New Press, a non-for-profit book publisher with a public interest mission founded in 1992. New Press Books explores issues that affect us all. Its authors provide ideas and inspiration for the activists, teachers, policymakers, and everyday citizens who are working to defend and promote democracy. In its nearly 30-year history, the New Press has published more than 1,000 books, including The New Jim Crow by Michelle Alexander, Lies My Teacher Told Me by James Lowen, Thick by Tressie McMillan Cotton, and more. Please visit them at www.thenewpress.com or follow them on Twitter or Instagram to find out more. Travis is going to start us off with a reading from the book, and then he'll be talking with Beth and with all of you. Please take it away, Travis and Beth.
Okay, Oliver, Greenlight, thank you so much for that introduction. Thank you so much for having me. And Beth, thank you so much for joining us tonight. Thank you everyone in the chat for coming. I spent a long time looking around this book for where to pull a rating from, and I eventually settled right at the very beginning. So this is how the book begins, at the very start of the prelude. When Jess Tilley showed up at the address she was given on a quiet street in Northampton, Massachusetts, the door was already open a crack. This made her nervous. Though it wasn't uncommon for Northampton residents to leave their homes unlocked during the day, this slightly ajar door was a signal that something was wrong. Jess didn't know the owner. She'd only spoken to her on the phone a couple of times before. They had connected for the first time 6 weeks earlier. The woman, a single mother, had found Jess's business card when digging through her 20-year-old son's backpack. Alongside the card was a bag of syringes and a small amount of heroin. The woman had called the number on Jess's card upset. First, she was angry. Then she had a bunch of questions, and she was crying, Jess says. Jess isn't a drug dealer. She distributes harm reduction supplies. Jess had given the woman's son the syringes, but not the heroin. After answering the woman's questions, Jess offered her Narcan, the generic name naloxone. It's a miracle drug that quickly reverses the effects of an opiate overdose. The two talked further, and Jess brought the woman to understand that if her son was going to use heroin, it was better he do so with clean needles and with Narcan on hand. Now, 6 weeks later, the woman had used that dose of Narcan and called Jess to ask for a refill. So Jess was standing outside her home, wondering why the door was ajar. "Help," Jess heard the woman scream. "Somebody help me." Jess had arrived at the house to deliver supplies. Now she realized she was responding to an overdose. She snapped into action and ran into the house. A boy, 18 or 19, Jess guessed, was sitting on the edge of his bed. She ran past him. Down the hall, she found a woman banging on a bathroom door. Her son had overdosed an hour earlier. That's where the Narcan had gone. Now he had overdosed a second time. And he lay unconscious on the other side of the bathroom door, which was locked. It was September 2019. Before the year was out, some 71,000 people would die after taking drugs, a number approaching the total deaths from car accidents and firearms combined, and to increase to 93,000 by 2020, compared to an annual average of 15,000 deaths some 2 decades earlier. Jess silently prayed this young man wouldn't be one of them. "Do you have a screwdriver?" Jess asked. "We'll take this door right off its hinges." The woman ran to the kitchen. Meanwhile, Jess took a step back from the door, gathered some momentum, and gave it a powerful kick. 3 more kicks and the lock snapped off, but the door still didn't budge. The boy inside had fallen against it, and now his unconscious body kept it shut. The woman returned with a screwdriver, and together the two of them managed to push the door open a crack and squeeze Jess through. "I get in and I immediately clear his mouth," Jess recounts, "and I start breathing for him. I ask, 'How long has he been out?' 5 minutes, the woman replied. "It happened just after I called you." "So I'm calculating the time it took me to get there," Jess says. "I'm breathing for him and he's not coming around. So I hit him with Narcan." Jess took the medication's nasal administrator, shoved it into the boy's nose and hit the release button. Then she waited a minute, and then 2 minutes. 2 very, very long minutes. But nothing happened. Jess loaded up a syringe, stuck a dose of intramuscular naloxone into the boy's thigh, and hit the plunger to inject it. Finally, he regained consciousness. "Where am I?" the boy asked. "Shit, where's my mom?" That's when Jess heard the boy's mother calling from down the hall. He's out, the woman screamed. "No, he's not out," Jess thought to herself. "He's here with me, and I know he's conscious because I'm watching him puke." Then Jess remembered the second boy who she caught out of the corner of her eye on her initial run through the house. Fuck, she thought. Jess grabbed the boy she just revived, ran with him toward the bedroom, and thanked God she always carries more Narcan than she expects to use. By the time they made it into the bedroom, the second boy was on the ground and already turning blue. There was a syringe in his arm and a green powder all over the place. Jess put the pieces together. The kid was injecting crushed Oxycontin pills, she realized, or at least what they thought were oxy pills. Jess knew this was actually fentanyl. A batch of the dangerous synthetic opiate was causing overdoses all over Northampton. It was disguised as green Oxycontin pills. So now the second boy is out, Jess says, and this woman is doing what parents do when this happens. She's panicking. She's wailing on his chest. I'm like, "You're going to break his ribs. What are you doing?" Jess took charge of the situation, responding to her second overdose in about as many minutes. "I revived the other kids so they both lived," she says it. She says it nonchalantly, but such situations are traumatic and extremely stressful. Every life Jess saves takes a toll on her. And that's how we begin Light Up the Night.
Wow, it's really gripping. And just want to say congratulations on this book launch. Thanks to Greenlight for having us. I want to start just with a background question. Before we get to the book, maybe you could tell us a bit more about your work and how you came to write about addiction, the overdose crisis, and things like harm reduction and drug user activism.
Yeah, Oliver mentioned I'm in Southern California now, but I'm a transplant. I immigrated here from Canada, from Vancouver, Canada, about 2 years ago. And that's where I started covering the overdose crisis. I was a general assignment reporter for a newspaper in Vancouver. And I would write about things up at City Hall and whatnot, whatever was going on that day. And we noticed in 2015 or 2016, pretty early in the continent's overdose crisis, that overdoses in Vancouver were beginning to jump up pretty sharply. My boss asked me to put a bit of time to this topic, and it was kind of a one-off. And then, a couple months later, they shot up further, and he said, spend some more time. And a year, 18 months later, the overdose crisis had become a full-time beat. And that was the only thing I wrote about.
Wow.
And that's how many people were dying. And that continued for the next 7 years. That's how far we are into this crisis, and that's how long people have been dying in Vancouver and across the entire continent. I really got sucked into this thing in Vancouver. I was living in the downtown east side, which is the poor part of Vancouver, where there's a concentration of addiction and mental health issues. And I would leave for work in the morning, and waiting at the bus stop next to me, there'd be a man with a sheet over him. And I would come home from work, and on the way into my apartment, I would pass by paramedics responding to an overdose. And the concentration of overdoses in Vancouver and in this neighborhood was just so intense. I think it's the only time in my career as a journalist I've actually been able to like visibly see a jump in statistics, like to actually watch it happen. And that just seemed like the topic that I was going to give all of my time to going forward. I wrote one book called Fighting for Space, which is about Vancouver's history for harm reduction that really came out of that experience with the overdose crisis there. And then it was touring that book around that I met the amazing people that would eventually become Light Up the Night.
Yeah, that which leads into my next question about how did you meet them? But I first want to just say, Fighting for Space. I'm doing a lot of reporting around harm reduction too, and a nascent drug users union in West Virginia, and they dog ear that book. They love that book, and they have gotten so many lessons from it. So I just want to and I too, it's over there with a bunch of underlined things. So thanks so much for that. Yeah, great. And but tell us how you met Jess and Louise, and I love the way you kind of go back and forth between their story. Talk about how you met them, and then how you approached this idea of like a almost like a dual biography, if you will.
Yeah, so I took Fighting for Space on the road a little bit, pre-COVID times when we did that. And stopped through about 10, 11, 12 cities in the United States. And I knew that I wanted to write a second book about the overdose crisis. Deaths were not going down, but I didn't know what that book would be. I was just kind of keeping my eyes and ears out, as I traveled from one city to the next. And Jess and Louise were just the most amazing people. Two of the most amazing people I've ever met, and definitely the most amazing people on that tour. Jess and I kind of hit it off laughing. She was introducing, she'd been assigned, we didn't know each other, but she'd been assigned to introduce me at an event in Boston. And there was a group there putting together a sort of mock supervised injection site that I said I would lend a hand with, and Jess said she would lend a hand with, and we were working side by side, and we were doing that without a manual, which I don't know if you've ever tried to put together a mock injection site without a manual. It's a difficult thing. And so we spent the afternoon doing that, and I got a little bit of her story that way. And, I learned she was organizing people who use drugs across New England, that she'd been doing this for a long time, that she felt it was more important than ever with the arrival of fentanyl and the overdose crisis. And as more and more of that story came out, I said, I've got to put this in a book. It was something sort of similar with Louise. I met her around a speaking event in Greensboro, North Carolina. I was speaking at a church, and I thought she might be there. I'd heard about her before. She was by far the most prominent drug user activist organizer in the region. And I was kind of hoping that she would come check out the book, right? But she didn't, and I found out it was because she was in the hospital. She had an infection in her leg, and a friend of a friend asked me to deliver her flowers. And so I went to the hospital with flowers in hand, and I walked into her hospital room, and it was like something out of a war zone. It was, she had activists there in person who were waiting in line to speak with her on a number of topics. And she had a video Zoom meeting open on a laptop in front of her ahead of a protest they were holding in New Orleans later that year. And while she was on the Zoom meeting and talking to activists in the room, she was on the phone in one ear talking to activists in another part of the country. And her family's off to the side, kind of helping her take notes on all this. And meanwhile, she's in the hospital, about to undergo a really serious surgery, maybe 45 minutes and a couple hours later. And I just said, I have to know more about you. This is amazing. And she was kind enough to invite me to come stay with her. Maybe she was just being polite. I don't know. But a couple months later, I showed up at her door, and that's what I ended up doing with Jess too. I made a lot of trips to Northampton, a lot of trips to Greensboro, and it was just an absolute privilege getting to know these women, and such a privilege, being trusted with their stories.
Yeah, that's awesome. And how did you conceptualize? How did you come up with like, I'm going to do a book like anchored in these two women?
Yeah, that was kind of there's a bit of luck involved, because fighting for space. There's a chronological narrative there, but it jumps around a little bit, and it's quite thematic in a lot of ways. With my second book, I wanted to tell a chronological story. I wanted to tell a narrative that would really pull mainstream readers in. And I didn't at first know how I would do that with Louise and Jess. They were different people living in different parts of the country, but they were so amazing. They were playing such amazing, important roles in this overdose crisis. And it was actually, it was a couple months after talking to them and getting to know them that I found out, they were working together, and they actually had each other on the phone a lot. It was one of the sort of serendipitous things. I met this woman in Boston, and I met this woman in North Carolina, and I found out I want to write about them. And then I find out they know each other well, and they're working together, and they're leading this movement alongside one another. And so the book just kind of structured itself that way.
Yeah, there is this moment when they come together that I think is really powerful. So many books now about the overdose crisis. You and I have each written 2 now. And tell us what's different about Light Up the Night.
Well, I've read a lot of books about the overdose crisis. Before that, I'd read a lot of books about the war on drugs. I'm a biography junkie. I love biographies and memoirs and that sort of thing. So I've read a lot of the books in this genre. And almost every single one of them I've read, is either by the parent of someone who uses drugs, or someone who used to use drugs a long time ago and is now, far in recovery. I've never found, a book that takes all of this in and recounts it for an audience, entirely through the eyes of someone who uses drugs. Not someone who used to use drugs and who now has written a self-help book about how to find treatment. Not someone who is kind of trying to hide their drug use. I wanted someone who says I use drugs, there's an overdose crisis happening, and this is the challenge that we as people who use drugs are going through. This is the tragedy that we're living through. This is how we're trying to deal with it. And so what I really believe is different about Light Up the Night is it takes that vantage point that I don't really think has ever been done through a full book before. Louise, Jess, and the many other heroes who are walking alongside them in this book are people who use drugs. They're not afraid to say it. They're not only people who use drugs, they're people who have a huge facet of characteristics, just like every one of us. But that's something that they're not afraid to say. And they're saying that it's important that I'm saying that because we have an understanding of the overdose crisis that if you're a politician or if you're a police officer, you might not have. And so I really hope that this book amplifies the voices of people who use drugs, whether they're still in the shadows, whether they're hiding their addiction, or whether they are out there in the world as activists like Louise and Jess. I believe the book is different that way. And I really hope it's different that way, putting that different perspective out there, because I think it's such an important perspective.
Absolutely. And I know it just kind of happened that they both come at their addiction stories through childhood trauma. Louise through untreated mental illness, Jess through abuse early in her life, and that's a real important sub-theme in the book, mental health, trauma, and how these challenges fit into addiction. Why are mental health and trauma so important to a book about the overdose crisis?
I kind of hoped by emphasizing your mental health and trauma through the book, I kind of hoped to spark an epiphany that was an epiphany for me many years ago when I was reading a book. I think it was 2009 and 2010, and as someone just noted in the comments before I could say it, it was Dr. Gabor Mate's In the Realm of Hungry Ghosts. I was reading that book on vacation somewhere. I didn't know a lot about addiction or drug use at the time, and that book it was one of those books that just kind of pivoted the way that you see the world. After I read Gabor's book, it was no longer junkies and criminals using drugs and stealing from us. it was, people who had experienced something hard in their life, or, people who had a hard time experiencing this world for whatever reason, and using drugs to cope with that difficulty, because, here in North America, we don't give them a lot of, systemic or institutionalized ways to deal with that pain. Our mental health care system is in shambles, or it's almost non-existent in a lot of parts of the country. And then we blame them for self-medicating, for coping on their own. And so it was this pivot. If these are people who have struggled with mental illness or trauma or abuse in their past, and now are self-medicating because we don't have a lot of ways to help them, what are we doing punishing them for that? It just became a clear example of victimizing the victim. Or going even further, if you're somebody who was abused and then you go through drug addiction, and because drugs are illegal, you're abused all different ways through that style of life you're forced into, in the hustle on the street and dealing with dealers and evading police. So you're victimized there, and then we throw you in jail for that, and then you're victimized there, and your crime was, being hurt when you were a child. If you've read Gabor's Hungry Ghosts, it's that understanding that I hope to instill in other people, the way Gabor instilled it in me, is that, people who are addicted to drugs, people who are in problematic drug use, are so often just somebody who was hurt a long time ago. And, for dealing with it their way, because we can't give them a better way to deal with it, we should not be chasing them. We should not be throwing them in jail.
Or waiting for them to hit bottom.
Which in this overdose crisis, so often is death.
Is death. Absolutely. That's really well said. Can you talk a bit about your writing and reporting process? The stories that you write are tragic, heroic, deeply personal. How did you get Jess and Louise to trust you? Were there moments where they went, oh, no, don't put that in? And then, like, that often happens, and then you have to negotiate, or sometimes people change their minds. How did you navigate all that?
Yeah. It was a daunting, scary prospect, sharing so much of other people's lives and going so deep on all of this. It started with a phone call with the three of us. It was actually a phone call that the three of us had together, where we said, this overdose crisis is happening, and all three of us agree that harm reduction, that things like needle exchange, that can help solve this crisis. How do we make people, understand that? And I kind of made the argument to the proposal. We can do this by getting your stories out there, and using your lives as examples of how harm reduction has helped you, and explain these often controversial, these often complicated topics through your lives and your stories, and hold people's interest that way, and hopefully teach them about the things that you think are so important. And I think they both deserve a lot of credit for saying, yes, we will share our stories for that purpose. And from there, it was a lot of phone calls. It was a lot of flights to Northampton. It was a lot of flights to Greensboro, in places which have both become second homes. I'm so grateful to Jess's partner and to Louise's mom, actually. Those are the places where I stayed when I was in Northampton and Greensboro interviewing these women. It was a lot of late nights. It was a lot of just wonderful conversations, over cups of tea with them too. I did get to know them both very well, and I think inevitably I grew very close to them. And that comes off in the book. I don't pretend to take a neutral position on any of this. Harm reduction is something I believe in, and these are women who I grew very close to in researching this book. Researching was easier than writing. It was, as I said, it was just a daunting process with this level of trust placed in me. There were, to their credit, again, there were very, very few instances where either of them, pushed back before or after the fact and said, I don't really want you to go there. There were places where they said, I'd like more emphasis or less emphasis there, but they were incredibly open. And, I think that people's understanding of harm reduction is going to benefit from that openness that they've been so brave to take.
Absolutely. You also spend a lot of time in the book talking about the war on drugs. The common perception is that the drug war has softened as authorities have struggled with how to cope with so many overdoses. You know, you'll hear police chiefs themselves say, well, we can't arrest our way out of this. But in fact, as you write in the book, you argue that the war on drugs has intensified. Can you elaborate on that and talk about how the drug war is affecting Jess and Louise today?
Yeah, there's this narrative that's developed out of the overdose crisis, that kind of says, the war on drugs really got going, or really escalated, intensified during the crack cocaine epidemic of the 1980s. And it intensified because the people who were using crack were Black, and we really went after them, not because they were using crack, because they were Black. I believe that's all true. Then the next step in that narrative goes, this overdose crisis really started in white populations using oxy, and so for reasons deeply rooted in racism, we kind of took our foot off the pedal there and eased up on the war on drugs. I think that a lot of that is true too, to a point. We've got bipartisan support for decreasing the mandatory minimums and that sort of thing. And I think that's where you're getting this idea that the war on drugs has softened. But since fentanyl arrived especially, and kind of took this overdose crisis into its third phase after pills and then heroin, I think what we've seen, I can honestly describe as, the greatest intensification of the war on drugs that America has seen in a generation. Policymakers are just scrambling to deal with fentanyl. Their constituents are asking for it. They're saying, what are you doing about fentanyl? And a lot of these politicians and lawmakers don't have any idea, except throw people in jail. And that's what they've done in response to fentanyl. I spend a lot of time in the back third of Light Up the Night talking about this thing called the drug-induced homicide charge. And that's really become a favorite tool of law enforcement in response to fentanyl in a lot of states and a growing number of states across the US. It says that if you give somebody drugs and they die, and that drug turns out to be fentanyl, you're not being charged with trafficking or possession or anything like that. We're charging you with murder, and you're going to jail for a very long time because you killed someone. And this law goes back to the 1980s, and it was designed to target, kingpins, Pablo Escobars and that sort of thing. But that's not how it's being used today. I found, researching this book, I found dozens and dozens, and then hundreds of instances of a girlfriend being charged with the death of her partner, of her boyfriend, or a brother being charged with the death of his brother. You go out to pick up for your wife, and you come back and use together, and she doesn't wake up, and now you're charged with murder. These are the kinds of people that drug-induced homicide is being used against. And that's where we see this intensification of the war on drugs. It's not solving the overdose crisis. It's not helping anyone. It turns one tragedy into two, and that's the only thing it does. Instead of one family member going to jail, or instead of one family member dying, you get one family member dying and the second one going to jail. And that's not what the deceased would have wanted. Mm-hmm. The other piece of that is something called the do not prosecute order. That I talk about a lot in the book. And this is something that Louise and Jess developed with the help of the sort of drug user union that they formed. And it says, if I die using drugs, I do not want anyone who gave me those drugs to go to jail. And that's in response to this drug-induced homicide charge that's developed, that's gained popularity, and this intensification of the war on drugs.
And how many states have that law now?
Oh, I mean, it's increased every year. It's more than a dozen now. And it's not one law. It's kind of a combination of a collection of laws. Mm-hmm. And some do, a heavier manslaughter charge. Some call it death by distribution. Most call it drug-induced homicide. Every state handles it a little different. But how it works is, if fentanyl was involved and someone dies around you that you gave those drugs to, you're going to jail for murder.
Whether you knew there was fentanyl in it or not.
Exactly. Yes, that's a great point. It does not matter whether or not you knew the drugs were fentanyl.
Mhm. You've said that the new book, it was really written to give a voice to people who use drugs. What is that voice saying? What do they think the solution is to turning back the overdose crisis?
Yeah, I mean, that's such an important question because it's, that's the answer that I want to get out there. The overdose crisis has killed so many people now, 100,000 in the 12-month period ending in May 2021, which is just an unfathomable number. It's a number that's brought a lot of people to the table, politicians, policymakers, law enforcement, grieving parents. It's still, especially at the federal level, has not brought to the table or allowed a seat for people who use drugs, which is just baffling in my opinion, especially after researching this book. Who else would know more about how to reduce overdose deaths than the very population that is overdosing? It's that voice that I want to get out there with this book, and the sorts of things it's saying are almost always rooted in harm reduction. So it's things like needle exchange. It's things like supervised injection, which for the first time in America just opened in New York in the last days of November. It's things like fentanyl test strips, which are becoming a more common harm reduction tool. It's things like it's things that are simultaneously simpler and more complicated, like reducing stigma. It's stigma and how we talk about people who use drugs that drives people into the shadows, that discourages them from asking for help, that forces people to hide their drug use in ways where they use alone in a basement instead of using in their living room where their partner can find them in case they overdose. It's stigma that prevents all that from happening. And so one of the most important messages they're saying is not something sexy like injection sites or needle exchange. It's talk about people who use drugs so that we can reduce stigma. And then there's larger objectives too, decriminalization and eventually even legalization and regulation. In America, I think that stigma is very deeply rooted in criminalization, in the war on drugs. That kind of reshapes how we think about people who use drugs. They're, by definition in this country, they're criminals, right? And it's difficult to ask for help or to use openly in ways that are safer if by definition, by law, you're a criminal. So ask people who know the overdose crisis better than anyone, what can we do to solve this? It's, reduce stigma, open needle exchanges so that there's entry points to the healthcare system, supervised injection so that there's a nurse looking over your shoulder in case of instead of a dealer. It's harm reduction. There are tools to begin reducing deaths. People know how to begin solving this crisis, but they're people who use drugs, so we're not listening to them.
Yeah, and so much of it, particularly in Appalachia and some of the places that were first hit hard by OxyContin, the politics have gotten so wiry and toxic that, for instance, West Virginia outlawed needs-based needle exchange. At the same time, they're having this huge HIV outbreak in Charleston. And I'm wondering what Louise and Jess would say to the harm reductionists I know there who are working really hard to introduce harm reduction there to places that are even less likely than the places you were reporting from to receive it. How do you change hearts and minds around this?
Yeah. I mean, first, I just want to say West Virginia, my God, I was working on a pet project that just saw me look up the overdose rate there last month. And, Vancouver has by far the highest overdose rate anywhere in Canada. And then West Virginia's is like triple what Vancouver's is. I mean, I couldn't believe it. I mean, it's far higher than anywhere else in the country. And like you just pointed out, that's the place where they're making a harm reduction, less accessible anywhere. Louise and Jess are amazing at talking to people who don't understand these concepts or who have problems with them. At times they can lose patience because it's their friends who are dying, sadly, and they don't, it's these people who are fighting the policies that that could save them. But they both, I mean, I've watched them do this. They'll walk into rooms and they'll hear people's concerns, and they'll, hear people explain why they oppose these concepts, why they oppose needle exchange. And then they'll say, yeah, okay, I understand, but, here's what this did for me, or here's what the data shows. And there is a mountain of data behind harm reduction now. Thankfully, it's one of these controversial policies that actually has a ton of scientific information backing it. And that's always been my approach too. We have to hear people's concerns, and we have to listen to them when they say when they explain, why they're afraid of something or why they oppose something. And I get it. It's needle exchange, it's supervised injection. It sounds counterintuitive. How do you, make someone healthier by giving them a needle? How do you get someone off of drugs by giving them a place to inject? But there are examples that show, this is counterintuitive. That's not actually the way it works. An injection site can act as an entry point to the healthcare system. There's academic studies out of Vancouver, out of Europe, that actually show drug users who use injection sites are more likely to enter treatment than drug users who do not use injection sites. And it's the same for needle exchange. I understand concerns. I hear them, but the data shows that's not actually what's happening at these places. And if we want to save lives, we have to begin to talk about this stuff that's scary to a lot of us.
Mm-hmm. One of the most moving things I heard from a harm reductionist, and I had never heard any other harm reductionists say this, and some think it's kind of controversial, but what she said was her goal was to get, how we always say in harm reduction, you have to meet people where they are. She was saying you have to meet the other side where they are too, and are there kind of baby steps that you can take in between. And I guess I'm just really interested in what you've learned about how to get beyond those cultural barriers, if that's applicable here. And then I know we have to, we're going to get to questions here real soon too, but that's kind of my last question.
Yeah, we'll go to Oliver after this. For me, the most effective way to explain harm reduction. I mean, by the way, that's great. If harm reduction says meet people where they're at, you got to do that to the other side. I think that's only fair, right? For me, the most effective way to explain harm reduction is to get people thinking about it a different way. It's kind of a compare and contrast picture. Picture a woman kind of entrenched in stereotypical street addiction, homeless in poverty, and she's injecting heroin because maybe she was abused 30 years ago, and now she's in a back alley, and she's using a used needle on the ground because, she lives in West Virginia and that's all she can find. And she's using puddle water because she looks like a drug user, so nobody will let her into the store to use for the bathroom. And she's looking over her shoulder and, rushing her dose in a very dangerous way because she's afraid of police. And then, she uses this used syringe with dirty puddle water in it to slam in an unmeasured dose of drugs. And the whole thing is just, and there's, all sorts of, men waiting at the other end of the alley for her to maybe go unconscious. And the whole scene is just awful. And then visit the supervised injection site in Vancouver, like I have done many times. And when you walk in there, there's, a clinical support worker who greets you with a smile, maybe the first smile you've seen all day if you're living on the street and having a hard time of it. And they give you a clean needle that comes out of a package where it's clean, and they give you a vial of water that, again, is clean, and they give you a table and a mirror, and you get time to measure out your dose so that you're not doing too much, and you take time to find a vein, and so you're not putting the needle in your body in a dangerous way. And when you look over your shoulder, it's not a dealer or some sort of man looking to prey on you. It's a nurse looking out for you in case you overdose, who says, I'm here to catch you if you fall, you're safe here. I just think when even if you're worried about the consequences of supervised injection, or you have ideological oppositions to these ideas, I just think when you look at those two pictures, you have to understand that one is better than the other.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. Absolutely. Oliver, do you want to jump in now?
Yeah, this has been such a lovely conversation. I hate to interrupt, but I do want to get to some of the questions from the audience. The first one we have is from Casey. They say, I'm in Maple Ridge and I've been working on at changing the stigma around addictions and homelessness, which are so nasty here. People are so afraid. How do we switch that fear into logic that if we pressure our government to care for people with addictions, they will have less to fear?
Yeah, Maple Ridge is a neighborhood on the outskirts, city actually, in the outskirts of Vancouver, Canada. It's kind of one of these places that not everybody associates with the overdose crisis. You know, it's a beautiful suburb on the edge of the city where, you know, where the homes are really nice and there's a lot of space and that sort of thing. But there's a lot of people dying there. And so it's a place where harm reduction has become really important. It can be a tough argument for people. You know, as I mentioned before, it's counterintuitive. How does, you know, needle exchange or supervised injection help get someone off of drugs? I just think, again, you know, we have to listen to people's concerns, really hear them, and then engage them, you know, in a conversation. You know, don't preach, ask them what they think about this and kind of try and address the specific points, the specific concerns that they have about needle exchange. And I think that what goes a long way is sharing stories, you know, which is what I tried to do in Light Up the Night and in Fighting for Space before that. There's a lot of people in these two books who might not be off of drugs, but who are doing drugs in much healthier ways, thanks to harm reduction. And I think if we're honest about our objectives, and that's where we begin to make progress. Is your objective to help improve people's health? Is it to put them in a safer place? Or is it really just to punish them and lock them in jail? And if it really is, you know, if you really are interested in improving their life and are not just interested in punishing them, then I think that you begin and you kind of establish that and get them talking about that. Then I think that you get to have a conversation about harm reduction a little easier.
Yeah, I think the next question from Ed kind of leads into that, asking, isn't the goal to stop using drugs while keeping users alive, not harmed until they are ready to stop? Which is something I feel like you've come back to again.
Yeah, it's a simple thing for me. You know, you cannot get someone into treatment if they're dead. And in the 12-month period ending in May 2021, 100,000 Americans died after using drugs, compared to 15,000 a year, roughly 20 years earlier. That is just an incredible increase. Way too many people are dying before they ever get the chance to go into treatment. The second answer to that question is not everybody wants to stop using drugs. And it's not, I don't believe, it's our role to force them. You know, if they're still dealing with something in their past that is so horrible and we don't have, you know, the tools necessary to help them deal with it in a better way, or if they're still using drugs for any reason, I believe it's their personal freedom to do so. And I don't think that because they've made that choice, that they deserve to be infected with HIV or left in an alley to die. I don't think that should be the punishment for using drugs. And so I think that regardless of what someone's choice is, we have to help them follow that choice in the healthiest way that they can.
Yeah. We have another question from Melissa Clark. Living in Appalachia, Allegheny County, Maryland is one of the counties with the highest overdose rates in the country, and second only to Baltimore City in deaths in the state. Thanks to help from grants, our organization will finally be starting an SSP here this year. If you had one piece of advice about what you learned, what would it be?
Yeah, SSP means syringe service program. It's another name for needle exchange, you know, where people who use drugs can access clean needles and avoid hepatitis C, HIV infections that way. I volunteered at many needle exchanges over the past 5-10 years. I've done a lot of outreach and that sort of thing. And the best advice is just the simplest. Just be kind to people. If you don't agree with what they're doing all the time, or that can be harder than it sounds, and that's just the way it is. Just be kind to people. Understand that they might have had a hard day. Give them a smile in case they haven't had one. Don't judge them. Whatever they're doing, they've made a great choice in visiting a needle exchange. They want to do whatever they're doing in a healthy way. Give them, lend them your ear, give them a shoulder to cry on if they've had a really hard day. I was volunteering at a needle exchange in the upscale community in Southern California called Santa Barbara. And this woman was waiting in line for a long time because the needle exchange is only open in Santa Barbara 1 hour a week, 2 hours a week. And she came into the van that we were doing mobile exchange out of. And she had to sit down for a minute because we had to register her real quick before we could give her clean needles. And she said, "Thank you. This is the first time I've been able to sit down all day." Just giving people 1 minute to get out of that hustle that a drug addiction brings because drugs are illegal goes so far with so many people. So just be kind and give people a space for them to be themselves.
Another question we have is from Nick Lupick. Did you know you were writing a second book when you met these two women you wrote about? Were there other people that were candidates for protagonists for your book?
Yeah, so I'll say hi to my brother there. I did not. I had my eyes and ears open for someone to write a book about, but I was very lost. I wanted to write a book, but I had no idea what it was going to be about. And if you've gone through any sort of a creative process before, you know that the idea can be the very hardest part. How do I get this thing started? But meeting Jess and then meeting Louise, before too long, it became easy. These were just two of the most incredible people I've ever met in my life. And I just feel so privileged that they have allowed me to share their stories and put so much, that level of trust is just almost beyond comprehension. And so I just can't thank them enough. And, I really think that readers can't thank them enough because I think so many people are going to learn so much from these two women.
Melissa Jacoby asks if there's enough time at the end, can you talk a bit about the book's title? Thanks.
Yeah, Light Up the Night is actually the book's second title, or third actually. The first, my initial title was Let Us Live, kind of saying just, leave us alone, let us be, and we'll do better. Talking to police there. And then a title that Jess and I kind of spitballed one night was A Labor of Radical Love, which is a title I kind of fought for. It's a phrase that Jess used at a conference I saw her speak at. I really kind of like that description of the entire movement. And then Light Up the Night was something that we agreed on with the publisher. And it's based off of a protest that Louise and Jess led, and their entire movement they're a part of led in New Orleans in 2019, was it 18 even? This was one of the first national movements, this national group that Louise and Jess have come to lead alongside a lot of people, really. This is one of their first kind of outings as a national movement. They were at a big conference, a drug policy conference in New Orleans, and they said they wanted to do something for so many people who had died in the overdose crisis already by that year. And also, not only stage something as a memorial, but as a protest against drug policy, which they argue and I believe has killed just as many people as the drugs themselves through this crisis. And so this large group gathered outside a hotel in New Orleans, and they walked with candles down to the river, and they held a banner there that said, Light Up the Night, with those candles representing so many people who have died through this crisis, kind of, bringing their lives back into the world for just a few minutes with those candles. So Light Up the Night.
It's amazing. We have a question in the chat that just caught my eye. Given the fentanyl crisis, do you believe all drugs should be legalized? If fentanyl-laced drugs are causing so many overdoses, is legalization the answer to preventing so many tragic deaths? Meaning, could regulation be the new war on drugs? And that's from Jennifer Place.
Yeah, that's a really great question. And it gets back to what we were saying a minute ago, about acknowledging people's concerns, hearing them when they say they oppose something. So really quickly, decriminalization is removing criminal penalties for substances like heroin and cocaine. It says if you're caught with heroin, you're not going to go to jail. Maybe you'll get a fine, maybe you'll get nothing, but we're just going to remove the criminal penalty. Legalization goes a step further. Legalization involves regulation. So think cigarettes, think alcohol. Decriminalization would remove criminal penalties. Legalization would actually bring currently illicit narcotics, cocaine and heroin, under government control and allow for things like testing for purity, for a reliable manufacturing process and government control over what's in those drugs. So it goes a big step further. This is an idea I posed for a very long time. Many years ago, initially for ideological reasons, I simply didn't believe that drugs should be legal. Later, for more pragmatic concerns, I don't really know if we want Pfizer or Purdue Pharma in charge of cocaine distribution in this country. They don't have a great track record on that sort of thing. What's legalization going to look like? But over the years, I came to believe that if you accept two very basic truths, and I think they are truths. One, that people have always done drugs and always will do drugs. This goes back to before the Egyptians. We have evidence of people using drugs. And if you understand now that fentanyl and now, even more dangerous substances like carfentanil have just made using drugs so dangerous that we're losing 100,000 people a year. If you understand those two things, people will always use drugs, and now people are dying of using drugs in numbers we can't accept. I've reluctantly come to understand I do not know what we do but legalize and regulate all drugs. I agree that it's a scary idea that could have unintended consequences, but I think what legalizing and regulating hard drugs like heroin will do pretty quickly, if done right, is remove the threat of fentanyl and carfentanil and begin to reduce overdose deaths. Quickly reduce overdose deaths in significant ways. A lot of people argue, especially in the drug user movement, Louise and Jess argue that this is not a drug crisis. This is a crisis of very bad regulations that have forced illegal drugs to remain illegal underground, where there's no regulation, where dealers can put anything they want in them. I don't know how we eliminate that risk without legalizing and regulating. That's going to be a tough conversation. And like I keep saying, we have to acknowledge people's concerns, talk with them about that, and really kind of have I think it's going to be what's a tough process navigating, how best to legalize and regulate. So there's all sorts of ways we could do it, and some of them will be better than others. But if our goal is reduce overdose deaths, I no longer know what we do but legalize and regulate.
On a related note, Casey asks, would legalization result in reduced crime?
Oh, significantly. I'll explain this through economics. There's a couple of trial programs underway in Canada where people who have been addicted to heroin for a long time are being given things like hydromorphone, which is a prescription opiate very similar to heroin. There's even a small trial in Vancouver, Canada, where longtime people addicted to drugs are being given diacetylmorphine, the medical name for heroin. And these drugs are being given to these people, paid for by the government of Canada at a very low cost. I think a dose of diacetylmorphine is 33 cents, and on the street that's $10. So, that's a times 30 markup. When you take drugs off the illicit market and regulate them, put them under a government umbrella, these drugs are cheap. Heroin, morphine, diacetylmorphine, these are not expensive substances. They're cheap to manufacture. We know how to manufacture them. We know how to manufacture them for pennies. The reason that they cost, $10 a flap on the street is because the dealers can charge whatever they want because the government keeps drugs illegal. And that's why people commit crimes to get them, because they're so expensive because of this monopoly of organized crime. When we legalize drugs, the price is going to plummet. There's going to be significantly less reason to commit crimes. And there'll be all sorts of, less tangible consequences around legalization, where people can feel they can hold a steady job while their addiction is known, and they can go in and load bags at a supermarket, or they can maintain jobs like Louise and Jess do, managing these nonprofit organizations and running needle exchanges. And then, if society's accepting this, that people who use drugs actually can hold down steady jobs and do a great job, and of course they can, then there's money in your pocket for these cheaper drugs that are provided by the government. There's, all sorts of ways that legalizing will reduce crime. There's some obvious by bringing down the price, but others less obvious. And I think that'll happen in all sorts of ways.
We have a somewhat related question because you were talking about Vancouver and the prices there. Janet McDonald asks if there's any hope for a safe supply in Canada.
Hi, Janet. There's a hope for it. It's happening, but it's happening so slowly. The prescription heroin program I mentioned has been treating, a single 100 patients in Vancouver for almost 2 decades now, 15 years. This hydromorphone program I mentioned, it's been going for more than 5 years now, and its numbers are similarly constrained, very small groups. A regulated supply, what is usually called a safe supply now in Canada and increasingly in the United States, I think is going to happen in Canada. In America, I've grown quite pessimistic about the war on drugs, and I've become worried if it is ever going to happen at all, even after a long time. But in Canada, I think we could see it happening, and then maybe there'll be enough of an example show and enough academic research eventually that can be followed in the United States. It's going to take a long time. These are not, if we're honest, these are deeply unpopular policies. Legalization, regulation does not have mainstream support, even with this many people dying every year and so many people affected by the overdose crisis. And so it's really a long process of education that we need to begin engaging on. That's how we established North America's first supervised injection facility in Vancouver. Now the city kind of pats itself on the back and says, look what we did here. We were the first, and it's done all these great things. But if you've read Fighting for Space, that what really happened with Insight, with that injection site, is local governments went kicking and screaming. And it was a long, plus 10 years, plus 15 years education campaign that had to happen to bring the public on side. And now the public in Vancouver is on side, and Insight is actually quite a popular facility in Vancouver, where the general population recognizes it does more good than harm. That's going to take an even longer time with safe supply, with legalization and regulation. I think what's going to be key is education.
This is probably going to be our last question as we come to a close. But Casey put two, I'm going to kind of combine two of these questions. Funny that people think the goal is to get people to stop using. I get that, but that sounds like it's a win for the community. What about the user? As Desmond Tutu said, we need to stop just pulling people out of the river. We need to go upstream and find out why they're falling in. Why do we punish people for using drugs? That's a core question.
Yeah, that river analogy. I just think it's a little, what's the word? It's a little paternalistic to believe that everybody wants to be pulled out of the river. People should be free to make their own choices. Now, a lot of people who are, deeply addicted to drugs, a lot of people who are addicted to drugs want to quit drugs very much. And we are not giving them proper tools to do that. We need to offer much more support than we should. And harm reduction is really one of those tools that, counterintuitive that may sound, is really one of those tools that can help people stop using drugs. But not everybody does want to stop. And I don't think it's fair to say that that is the only answer. I don't think it's fair to continue criminalizing drugs, which maintains an uncertain narcotic supply where these people who use drugs don't know what they're putting in their bodies. I think that a big piece of all this is autonomy over one's own body. What legalization will do is provide autonomy over one's own body to actually know the substances that you're injecting in yourself. So while I think that treatment will be the goal for a lot of people, I don't think it will be for everyone. And I think that we have to come to terms with that and say that people do get to make their own decisions. And if we legalize and find ways to minimize crime that way and all that sort of stuff, and it's not a problem for the community, then I don't think that we should be forcing people to do anything.
Well, that kind of wraps us up for the night. I just want to say thank you so much for the fantastic reading and discussion. It was really engaging and just great to hear you guys going back and forth and hear all your answers. Thank you to all of the audience members for joining us. Please don't forget to buy your copy of Light Up the Night in store or online at Greenlight Bookstore. And we have that Greenlight Events 10 for the discount. Thank you so much to everyone, and just have a great night. I'm going to go ahead and end everything now, unless you guys have anything you would like to say.
Oh, buy the book from Greenlight. Please support independent bookstores. These lunch events would not happen without independent bookstores. There are so many authors everywhere, all around the country, would never get their books off the ground without bookstores like Greenlight. Support
Absolutely.
them. Buy the book from Greenlight.
And as Travis was saying, education is so key, and this book is just a wonderful education for everybody. Dealing with, we have a third of American families that have dealt with this crisis in one way or another now. And the numbers, if you go back to 1996, we've lost over 1 million people to drug overdose death. And so hats off to you, Travis, for digging into this subject, which I know isn't an easy topic at all. So thanks again to Greenlight for having us tonight.
Yes, thank you guys.
Beth,
Yeah, have a great night.
Bye, everyone. Thanks for coming.
Bye.